Welcome, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are, to our Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. I always try and forget how many there are each week, and it's about 35 this week that we've been going for. Online sport events in the context of COVID-19. This week we have Alex Farnell from the University of Lancaster. He's presenting for the second time in this series, which is fantastic. And speaking of presenting in the series, I want to take a moment as we kick off just to flag up that we have a call for submissions out. So if you want to present in the series after Christmas, in our winter series, then please do fill out that. It's a Google form. I'll put the link into the chat. There's a tweet and there's also a comment in the team as well. And drop me an email if you need any of the details. But please do sign up if you want to present in the spring or after Christmas, let's say. It's still winter, isn't it, unfortunately. But don't wish to hold up Alex any longer. Alex is presenting on special ones, the effect of head coaches on football team performance. Alex, all yours.
Thanks very much, James. So let me just get the slides up. There we go, back to the start. Is that okay? Can you see that?
Yeah, that's great.
Excellent. Good, so yeah, thanks very much, James, and thanks. You said this is the second time I'm here, so thanks for having me on again. And thanks to everyone who's turned up in the audience today. Looking forward to hearing any comments, questions you've got on this piece of work. So it's joint with Alex Bryson, who's at UCL, Tunde Buraimo from Liverpool, and Rob Simmons from Lancaster. Rob's certainly here, so if there are any questions, I don't know if you can see the chat, but we might be able to address them as we go along. And we're talking about special ones, which is the effect of head coaches on football team performance. But we can't really talk about special ones without talking about the special one. Of course, this is Jose Mourinho, and this was the statement he came up with in his first Chelsea press conference. Sorry, I can actually just hear myself speaking. Change around. Can you still hear me?
Yep, I still hear you.
Good, yeah. Use the computer instead. So yeah, of course, he said this statement. He said, "Please don't call me arrogant, but I'm a European champion, and I think I'm a special one." So he's the self-proclaimed special one, but probably quite justified in thinking that about himself at the time. He'd just done really well at Porto, won the league, more famously won the Champions League. He was young at the time, kind of thought of as this being up-and-coming young new coach, and Chelsea appointed him under this impression that appointing a highly skilled young manager would make a difference to their performance, and it did. It worked out pretty well for them. I think they won the league first 2 years he was there, won a lot of games, played good football, so it was a success. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work out quite so well. Remarkably similar circumstances, fast forward a couple of years, Chelsea went back to Porto and they appointed Andre Villas-Boas, who, like Mourinho, was very young at the time, thought of as this being, this young up-and-coming manager. He'd won the league, won the Portuguese Cup, and the Europa League as well with Porto. So Chelsea thought, again, we'll appoint this manager and hopefully it'll make a difference to our team performance. But of course, it didn't work out so well for him, and he was sacked after about 6 months. Rumours that he was falling out with his senior players. And just chatting to James just before, he says that he was sacked after West Brom, which is apparently a curse that a lot of managers suffer. After playing West Brom, they get the sack. So what are we trying to say with those two examples? Well, a couple of things really, but primarily is that we think that leaders should matter in determining the performance of their organisation. So it's important that you somehow pick the right leader, whatever right entails. And it doesn't just have to be in sports. We can think across a whole array of settings where this might be the case. I guess rather timely, given the events the last couple of weeks, we can think about politics. Various political leaders are blamed for defeats in elections and praised for victories in elections. The same would go for various military battles in history. And we can also just think about more conventional business settings. Now, economists have long held this view that leaders matter, and it was formalised really by Rosen in 1990, who argued that the quality of decision-making right at the top of organisations has important impacts, not just for the productivity at the top, but for productivity of the entire firm, because the quality of that decision making filters down through the ranks. But picking that right leader is quite difficult, and that was really the other thing that we wanted to get across from those examples. It can be quite difficult to select the right leader. But perhaps not surprisingly, it's been quite difficult to establish a causal link between the contribution of a leader or a manager and the performance of their organization. And there's a couple of reasons why. First off, managers aren't randomly allocated to different firms. Of course, they're chosen for a particular reason. But more importantly, and the reason, or how we normally get at this in the literature, look at manager contribution, is we look at what happens when there is a leadership change. But it's not just a case of comparing performance before and after, because of course that leadership change is usually endogenous, right? They leave for a particular reason. Usually that reason is they're not doing well enough, the firm is performing quite poorly. So we can't just compare performance before and after. Now, there have been a few attempts in the literature to try and identify some kind of causality by finding events that are plausibly exogenous. Besley et al., for example, look at cases of unforeseen death of heads of state, while Benetton et al. Look at cases where the CEO is hospitalized. So both of those, plausibly exogenous events. I guess there could be a slight issue in the second one if the CEO suffers perhaps undue stress because the firm isn't performing well enough, then that might break down the instrument. But in general, I think those are two good examples of how we can find some exogeneity. Now, of course, in the sports econ literature, we make this similarity between the role that a head coach plays for a football club and the role that a CEO plays for a more regular firm, in the sense that they're hired by owners or directors, someone that's higher up in the organization than them, to manage day-to-day activities. So I probably should say at this stage, I might interchange between using head coach and manager. At least as far as we're concerned for this research, we're going to think about them as being the same. There probably are subtle differences what goes on in reality for football clubs. Probably related to something I've got a point here about whether or not they have a say in transfers. The days that managers are this all-powerful figurehead of the football club is probably gone, and now a lot of those responsibilities have moved over to someone. They're called sporting directors, directors of football, whatever. But at least as far as we're concerned, the title doesn't really matter. We consider them as being the same. What else do they do? Well, of course, they're the ones who pick the team. They're the ones who train the team. They have their ability to hire their own backroom staff, and of course, they can decide on the tactics as well. So if they want to set the team up as a defensive team, as an attacking team, whatever, they can do that. So it's reasonable to think that they should play a role in determining the performance of the organization. But of course, picking the right coach in not just football, across all sports is quite difficult. We might be a club looking at a manager who's doing really well elsewhere, but it might be difficult to think whether those skills are going to translate into success at our club. It might be that's just a club-specific effect. And of course, there's this market failure that's been identified in the literature, where because we have talent that's industry-specific and it's only revealed when you have had a job, it creates this issue, if you like, whereby we tend to see the same managers getting different jobs over and over again. The same managers just tend to be recycled between different clubs because they've got experience and we know what their ability is like. There might potentially be managers out there who are very, very skilled, very able, but we don't know that because they've never had a job, which is why we get Sam Allardyce's being hired over and over again. But of course, it's important that you get this hire right, because it's quite costly to change managers if it goes wrong. So Jose Mourinho, who we've mentioned already, eventually found his way to Man United when they wanted to get rid of him, and his backroom staff, they had to pay them off something like £19 million. So I'm sure there are some United fans who say that's probably the best in the last 6 or 7 years. But it is costly, right? Spurs, similar kind of values. It cost them about £12.5 million when they sacked Pochettino. So what's the theory here? Well, at heart, it's a principal-agent relationship. The principal, who we can think about as being the owner of the club or the directors, will hire the agent, who's the head coach, to oversee this day-to-day running. And they're going to be hired when the match-specific surplus, which we can think about as being some kind of benefit of making this hire, exceeds the cost of making that hire. And that employment relationship will run until one of them feels that this surplus falls below some outside option. Now, crucially, this outside option, of course, can be there for both the principal and the agent. So either one of them could decide that they would want to terminate the employment relationship. If that comes from the firm, from the football club, then their alternative option is, of course, in the form of another head coach. So they'll be looking at the current performance of the football club, and they'll think that there's going to be someone else out there, another candidate who we can bring in and is going to make a difference to team performance. So assuming they're acting in some kind of rational way, which would be some kind of win maximizing framework, then they'd have a short list. They would hire the person that they think is going to do the job best, and performance should therefore improve. On the other side of things, the head coach also has outside options, and that's in the form of alternative employment. So they might get a job offer from elsewhere and think that this is going to be more beneficial to my career, so I can quit. I can go to this other club. But as for how the current club reacts, then this is essentially a shock to them, because it's something that they can't necessarily plan for. So it's unclear as to how performance is going to be affected following a quit. Now, of course, we're by no means the first to look at this. It's a reasonably well-researched area. Van Oors and Van Tuyl have got a really nice review in their 2016 paper, and they generally find that the short-term effects are insignificant. So managers don't really contribute that much to team performance. The Madum 2016 paper is quite interesting because that's a bit of an exception to this. They find that the average treatment effect on the treated teams, so teams who actually change their head coach, is significant, but they find that to be the case for home games only. They don't find any effect. They look at the average treatment effect on the non-treated teams, and they take those two things together as being some kind of idea that clubs are optimizing. So if you should have changed your head coach and you did, then it made a big difference. But as I said, the general consensus is that it doesn't really matter that much. And even if there is some kind of short-term effect in the first 5 games or so, sometimes called the motivational bump, performance very quickly just goes back to where it was anyway. But that's in the short term. There are possible benefits from having your coach stay on for a longer period of time. It's just difficult to tease out any of those effects because it's so rare that we observe coaching spells that last, I guess 2 or 3 years would now be classed as a long-term appointment. So it's really difficult to tease out any of those effects. But it is possible. What goes on from borrows something from the health econ literature, which is about on-the-job learning. That Martin Gaynor paper there is in the AER, and that looks at liver transplants and how they benefit from doctors doing the procedure more regularly. And we can also think about possible benefits from recruitment. So if coaches have got continual access to the transfer market, then they should be able to mold a squad that somehow fits with their what they want to do a little bit better. Now, of course, all that begs the question, if it doesn't really make a change, at least in the short term, why would you even bother making a coaching change? And the two bits of theory that come out of the literature are the scapegoat hypothesis and the hot hand fallacy. But of course, you could frame that the other way and say, well, if things aren't going well, then why wouldn't you at least try and make a difference by making a coaching change? Now, this difference between quits and dismissals, it's been something that has been a little bit overlooked in the literature so far. But in a paper that Bryson et al. There, that's the same group of authors as this one, we got a paper out that says that quits and dismissals are actually different outcomes for football coaches. So they have different identifiable runs of performance, for example, different identifiable head coaching characteristics that we can look at in the build-up to these two different outcomes. So they are fundamentally different. Ian Gregory-Smith has got a similar kind of idea looking at CEOs. So those two bits of evidence, along with the theoretical discussion that we mentioned earlier, I think merits further investigation into whether these different outcomes have different impacts for team performance, which is where we come in. So to look at this, we've got 15 years of data from the top 2 levels of football from France, Italy, Germany, and Spain, which gives us about 45,000 matches. At the moment, we're not actually making any use of these cross-country differences, which could exist. The only real benefit that it gives us at the moment is that it gives us a lot more matches to look at and a lot more quits and dismissals to look at. But it is something that could be done in the future, I think, is to look at cross-country differences. Of course, for each of these matches, we've got a home team and an away team, and for each of those teams, we know who is in charge. So it effectively doubles our sample size up to about 90,000 coach team observations on a match-by-match basis. So over this period, there are 273 teams that appear. 815 coaches are in charge of those teams during that period. And we can identify when they started a particular job, when they finished. When they finished, did they finish as a result of a quit or of a dismissal? Now, dismissals are quite easy to get at. It's fairly easy to understand what's going on. Quits are a little bit more difficult, but normally what we mean by a quit is that a manager is poached. So they are offered a job by another club and they accept that job. And that normally happens within a couple of days of leaving their previous club. It could be other things. Retirements, for example, would be classed as a quit, but predominantly it's managers moving to different clubs. The slight difficulty is if the official reason is listed as mutual consent, because that implies that there is some kind of, both parties want this to happen. But what we think in reality is happening there is that the club is saying, we're going to sack you, but we're just going to say it's mutual consent so you can save face. Maybe it makes it easier for you to get another job. So if it's mutual consent, we actually class that as a dismissal. We've got other information on coach characteristics, so we know about any of their previous jobs. We know if they've had success or failures in their previous jobs. And all those things that we have can be classed under the umbrella headings of either club specific or general human capital. And we've got lots of information on different measures of team performance. Now, we take that at the moment as being points per game, but we could look at, for example, goals scored, conceded, which could be goal difference, for example. And we can also form information about opposition form and get information about home advantage, which will come into the estimation strategy a bit later. So to give you an idea about quits and dismissals, those managers, we have experienced 1,327 dismissals and 533 quits over this 15-year period that we've got, which of course means that managers have more than one job, at least on average, over their career and over this period that we observe them. The average is about 4.5. Incredibly, one guy that we had called Eduardo Reja had 23 jobs over his career, and he's now actually in his 24th. He's now managing the Albania national team. But 23 jobs is a pretty staggering amount over a career. But perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised, because most of them came in Italy, most of them came in the Italian second division, where your job security, even by the standards of football manager, is pretty low. So Italy is quite an interesting case. Germany, on the other hand, I don't want to say your job security is stable as a football manager, but it's certainly more stable than in Italy. France and Spain are somewhere in between those two extremes. The other feature, of course, is that there are different periods of the season when we are more likely to observe these different events. The spikes you can see here. Over on the left is dismissals, over on the right is for quits, and quits are more likely to happen at the end of the season in particular than in any other period. The same is true for dismissals, but they are a little bit more evenly distributed over the rest of the season as well. Now, that makes sense for a couple of reasons, because that's when managerial contracts end. They normally end at the end of the season, so if you're going to get rid of someone without making a costly payoff, that's when it makes sense to happen. But also, of course, the end of the season, you have a couple of months off without any games. It's when the transfer window happens as well. So it gives the new manager kind of more time to get his ideas across, make any changes with the transfer market that he wants. So that's why we see these spikes at the end of the season in May and June. The other feature for dismissals over on the left is that there's a very low chance of being dismissed at the start of the season, but then it quickly kind of accelerates up until the midpoint and then plateaus off until the end of the season. That's about how much time you have to make a difference. You know, if you're right at the start of the season, maybe things aren't going well, then you've still got time to make a change, or the same manager can try and make a difference. But as we get towards the end of the season, then a new manager coming in won't have as much time. So that's why we see this this kind of shape here. Now, of course, one of the big things that's likely to impact on dismissals is performance. If you're not performing well enough, then you're probably going to get the sack. But what the literature suggests is that it's not performance in absolute terms that matters, it's more performance relative to some kind of expectation about performance, which we now know as surprise. And we do this very similar to a lot of other papers since the Van Oors and Van Tuyl paper. We use bookmaker odds and we can form expected points from this. We just correct for the overround using this weighting function here in equation 1. And then once we've got those expected points, we can form surprise, which is just the difference between the actual number of points you got and the points that you were expected to get for that game. So of course, a positive value on this means that you did better than expected for that match. A negative value means you did worse than expected for that match. Now, the really nice thing about surprise is that we can also sum across past games. So if we want to get an idea about how well they've been doing relative to expectations over the last couple of games, we can just sum over that period of games, and we go back as far as 10 games to identify possible spells that could impact a departure. So here are the descriptives. The average tenure length, I was surprised about just how short it actually was. It's between 44 and 45 games, which of course the season lengths vary by country and by tier, but it works out as being just over a season on average that you get in charge of a club. Performance variables we've got here, we've got the surprise, and we split them up into different spells going back up to 10 games, and we've got other things here such as position. What we actually mean by position is because we've got two tiers, it's actually the rank of those two tiers combined. So it's like a running variable from the top of the first division to the bottom of the second division. Quite a few head coach characteristics, things like experience, age, all possible things that could matter in all this. And then those two measures of season progress are accounting for those two charts that we showed earlier with this spike at the end of the season, and for dismissals, increasing chance of dismissal as we move throughout the season. So how do we address this? Well, we've got two approaches. We start off with just a baseline OLS regression, but that comes with possible biases involved. So our preferred method is we use something called entropy balancing, which I'll come on to discuss in a second. But the basic specification looks something like this, which would be our outcome equation. We look at performance for team I against opponent J in season K, which is upcoming points per game, and we look at an analysis spell up to 25 games in the future. The important variable here is this dummy variable where we identify coaching changes. Of course, because we've got two different types of coaching change, we've got this specification twice, with one for quits, one for dismissals. And then in the vector of controls, we include things such as previous team form, we've got opposition form in there, and we also look at home advantage in there as well. And in various specifications, we can add in, if we want, season fixed effects, team fixed effects, tier fixed effects would be another one as well that we could add in. So the OLS regression, the results look something like this. As you can see, not a great deal going on at all for either quits or dismissals. Quits is over on the right, dismissals over on the left. For quits, nothing at all is significant across this 1 to 25 games in the future. For dismissals, there is a little bit of something that we're picking up right at the end of this spell, so kind of 18 to 25 games after a coaching change. There is a bit of something going on. It's statistically significant. Whether it's of any sporting significance is another question. We're looking at about 0.02 to 0.03 points per game over 18 to 25 games, so it doesn't really seem that much of an effect. Then again, if that's the difference between you being relegated and staying in the league, then you'd probably deem that as being a success. But on the main, it doesn't seem that there's much going on at all. Of course, the problem with the OLS regression is that it's likely to be biased in some way because that managerial change variable is endogenous. It's not a random event that takes place. Now, the conventional way to get around this would be to apply some kind of weighting estimator or some kind of matching estimator. And we have run these. We have done IPW array. We've done some propensity score matching. But the problem that we're finding is that the balance tests that we need to work for these aren't particularly convincing. In fact, that's putting it mildly. They're actually pretty horrible. So we're not too convinced by those results, which is where we come on to entropy balancing, and that kind of gets around those problems. So we're not going to show the IPW array stuff, but what is good to show in the meantime is the kind of the first stage estimate from all that, which is predicting the treatment model. So here what we do is we run a multinomial logic model where the outcome is these different types of failures, which we could go on then to use. We could use these propensity scores in some kind of weighting estimate. But the treatment model looks like this. Just to give you an idea of what variables are associated with these two types of exits. For dismissals, surprise from the most recent game is the most important, really. So that's a negative coefficient, so performing worse than expectations is associated with a higher chance of dismissal. That makes sense. Also significant for if we go back 2 to 5 games, it's also pretty important, but as soon as we go any further back and look at games 6 to 10, then it drops out of being significant. So it's very short runs of form that seem to matter. The effect of experience is quite interesting. So more experienced coaches seem to have some kind of protective effect against dismissal, even when we're controlling for performance. And that's also shown, I guess, by the indicators we've got down here of previous success. So any previous promotions, any previous cups that these managers have won seem to be associated with a lower chance of being dismissed. Also, an ex-player is quite interesting as well. If you're an ex-player, it also seems to have some kind of protective effect. On the other side of things, for quits, there's not a great deal going on, but the interesting thing is to look at the effect of age. And this is saying that older coaches are less likely to quit, or on the other way, younger coaches more likely to quit. And that makes sense when we think about what we mean by quits. We said quits are in most cases managers being poached by other clubs, managers moving to different clubs. And it makes therefore sense that we see that as being younger managers are more likely to move. If we think about why you'd make a hire, we're looking at the benefits of making that hire back from the theory. Younger coaches have a higher surplus when you make that hire. Of course, hiring an older coach, there could be issues about possible retirement, possible health-related concerns. So it makes sense that we see age entering with a negative effect there. So we could use that in IPWA, but as I said, the balancing tests aren't particularly convincing, which leads us on to why we came across entropy balancing. So this is a method that was introduced by Heinmuller in 2012, and then the stator command is ebalance here, written by the same author along with Zhu. But what it is, it's kind of a bit of a dirty black magic trick to get pretty perfect balance for your covariates. It's a pre-processing method, and it simply reweights your data to achieve perfect covariate balance. And it does that while satisfying certain moment conditions. So it tries to get these distributions of your treatment and your control variables to be as close as possible, based on the mean of these distributions, based on the second moments, the variance, third moment skewness. We can go up and look at higher moments if we want as well. The stator command actually only allows you to go up to the third moment to look at skewness. But by doing this, by controlling or getting these background characteristics across our treatment and control groups to be similar, we're trying to strip out as much of that selection into treatment as we can from the outcome equation. And that way we can think about this quits and dismissals as mimicking some kind of random process. The other really nice thing about entropy balancing is that it prevents this need for continually going back and forth between your treatment model, your balancing tests, you're looking at how they perform in your outcome equation. It's quite time consuming, it's quite frustrating when it doesn't work out. So this just does everything in one nice step for you. It gives you the weights, and then you just use these weights in a weighted OLS regression. A bit more formally, how it works is that we can start off by considering how we would use propensity scores to form some kind of counterfactual mean. This is our unknown quantity here, where we're looking at the outcome for the treatment group, for the control group, had they have received treatment. And assuming that we've correctly specified our propensity score model, then we can think about this process as mimicking some kind of random process if we've got the our covariates are appropriately balanced. But as I said, this is quite time consuming, and importantly, it's prone to misspecification. So what entropy balancing does is it just kind of generalizes the propensity score. We've got the same quantity here that we want to estimate, but we've now got the weight W. W is the weight that the entropy balance command in Stata chooses for you. And it does that by trying to minimize the entropy distance, which we can think about as being some kind of measure of distance between the two for our treatment and control group. So it finds a W to try and get those as close as possible, subject to a couple of constraints. And the key constraint really here is equation 7, this first constraint, which is describing our balance constraints. And that describes whether we want to get them to be similar on just the mean, whether we want them to get them similar on the variance. And as I said, Stata can also go up and look at the skewness as well. So that's how entropy balancing works. Just to show you how well it works, what we have in the raw data is, of course, the treatment, the unweighted treatment and the unweighted control. And you can see that the means are pretty different, the variances are pretty different, the skewness is different as well. But after applying these weights, you can see how similar they become. So now comparing the unweighted treatment and the weighted control groups, and they are remarkably similar across all the variables. Now we actually only asked Stata to balance this on the mean, but it also does a pretty good job, even when we're not asking it to balance out the variance and the skewness as well. So it's a really neat trick for getting covariate balance. This is for dismissals. It also works just as well for quits. Again, the unweighted treatment and now the weighted control group are remarkably similar here across the covariates. So then applying these weights to an OLS regression, we get these results. So for dismissals over on the left, previously we were seeing games 18 to 25 pick something up. Now they've completely disappeared, and throughout the whole follow-up spell, games 1 to 25, we're not seeing anything significant. Quits is the same, again, nothing happening over that entire follow-up spell. Now, we do run a couple of alternative specifications, starting off with how we define our follow-up spell. If I just go back a slide, it's conceivable that the managerial change happened, and then 10 to 15 games later, so this kind of portion, if things aren't going well, the team could change their manager again, and it happens quite frequently, particularly Italy and Spain. It's not that rare to find that managers won't last 20 games. So we can change our definition of our follow-up spell and run it on teams that just stuck with their coach for that entire follow-up spell. And this is what we find. Perhaps not surprisingly, we see that now we have positive effects both for dismissals and also for quits as well. I say that's not particularly surprising, because if we're restricting this to teams who don't change their head coach, then presumably they're by definition just doing better anyway. But it does also raise another interesting point, that if you actually get that head coach higher right and you're happy with that head coach and you stick with them, then potentially we could see some benefits over a longer spell than we normally think about in the literature, rather than just that initial 2 to 3, 2 to 4 game period right at the start. So a couple of other things we do. Previously, those estimates were looking at both within season and also between season changes. But there are a couple of reasons why that might be difficult to compare, particularly comparing performance across seasons. Teams change divisions, teams make transfers, so performance isn't exactly comparable across seasons. So we can just restrict our definition of changes to look at what happens to within-season coaching changes. Unfortunately, we've only got enough dismissals to do this. So out of the 1,300 odd dismissals we have, 883 of them occur within season. We don't actually have enough quits within season to see what's going on. But for within season dismissals, this is what we get. Certainly nothing positive going on. No positive effects at all. There's actually some evidence that it might even produce a negative effect. What are we looking at here? About games 7 to 12-ish in the future. It might actually produce some negative effects following a mid-season coaching change. Now, taking that together with what we found when we looked at both within and between coaching season coaching changes, where we found it was pretty much zero, it suggests that perhaps changing your coach between seasons, when there is this period of time where you're not having any games, where you can use the transfer market, it could actually suggest that we might pick up some positive effects from that. We'd have to go and run that regression to be sure about that, but at least this is, I think, what that might be hinting at. So possible benefits from changing your coach between seasons. And then the final thing that we do is we just run an alternative specification where we take out the coaching characteristics from the balancing covariates. And we did this because we got into a bit of a discussion about, well, what factors, if you're the owner of a football club, are going to determine whether you change your head coach or not. It's probably just some combination of how you're performing and season progress. Whether you take a look at, in reality, whether you take a look at the coaching characteristics, we weren't too sure about, but it doesn't seem to make a difference if we take them out or not. Again, for both quits and dismissals, we're seeing insignificant effects across this whole follow-up period. So just to sum up those results, I think in general they're pretty consistent with what the literature says, in that head coaches are thought to contribute very little to team performance. We do find a little bit of evidence that perhaps there is some longer term benefit, particularly if you get the head coach appointment right. And when we allow performance to straddle seasons, that does seem to be some story that we're getting out. But the important thing is here that what we've added in is we've been looking at this difference between quits and dismissals, and we don't really find that that there's much difference, despite what we thought and despite what the theory would predict. So that pretty much brings me to the end. I'll just quickly sum up, and then looking forward to hearing any questions. We've been looking at the effect of leadership, whether it matters for organisational performance, but of course using football head coaches to look at that. And as with most of the literature, we don't really find that there's much going on. Neither quits nor dismissals seem to matter for any kind of follow-up period in terms of performance. Now, what I would say is that this is still relatively short-term periods that we're assessing, but I do think there is potential to look at possible longer-term benefits of staying with your coach. I mentioned related to on-the-job training, having access to the transfer market to improve your playing staff, and there's a couple of examples that I think work quite well. It pains me to say it, but Jurgen Klopp at Liverpool started off with a pretty average squad. 5-6 years later, they're unfortunately one of the best teams in Europe. An example that makes me think about much happier times as a football fan, we can think about Sir Alex Ferguson at Man United. That's, I guess, the classic example of the benefits of a longer-term coach. And the example that I really like is Ralph Hasenhüttl at Southampton. Only about this time last year, of course, they lost 9-0 to Leicester. 12 months later, they found themselves at the top of the Premier League for the first time in their history, and they're still doing pretty well at the moment. So that pretty much is it. I'll stop speaking and open up the floor to any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Alex. Really good talk. I'm getting the echo now, but it's gone. There we go. Okay, so in terms of questions and comments that are in the chat. Jorge asks, are you considering only league games and no Cup or European games?
Yeah, it's only league games. I think certainly for the majority of clubs, that's the right way to go. That's what they would assess their performances on. I think potentially for the very big clubs, it would only be the very big clubs that would assess their performance on European competitions, for example, or maybe domestic cups as well. But I think for the majority of teams, they would assess their performance based on league performances.
Okay, then I had a kind of a clarification question, which I may have missed your explanation of, but in your questions you had position and position squared, and I just wondered what those variables were.
Yeah, position is it's essentially league position.
Right, I see.
But because we've got two tiers, we take that as the rank.
You mentioned it. Yeah, no. So it's when I suddenly had in mind the playing position of a manager.
No,
I don't know why. I mean, the kind of mental connection there. So my bad.
No, we do actually have that in. I'm not sure.
Is it true that strikers are crap managers then?
Well, as a United fan with Ollie in charge, I couldn't possibly say, but I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, we did think about does the replacement coach characteristics make a difference? I think it could be interesting. It's probably another paper, but we got bogged down with, well, it's probably endogenous anyway if you bring in a certain type of coach depending on what's gone on. So yeah, potentially future work.
Yeah. Cool, thank you. Stefan's next question, which was, he says, I don't quite get the treatment control language here. The treatment is firing the coach. If so, what is the control group? Isn't every club in your sample treated, and often more than once? So what's the difference between 1, 2, 3, 4 treatments?
So we're doing it game by game. So a treatment game is firing your coach in that game or the coach quitting in that game. We've got two separate treatments. I mean, it does. We have kind of discussed this amongst ourselves that what really is the unit of analysis here, is it whether it's a game by game, or is the unit of analysis, should it be a spell? Difficult to pin that down exactly, but yeah, the actual treatment is being fired after a game. And then we form control spells around that by looking at points per game in 25 game in the future intervals around that.
Okay, thank you. Then the first hand up was Jean-Louis. If you want to ask your question. Jean-Louis, do you want to ask your question? Okay, well, assuming that Jean-Louis is having... there we go. Yep, go on.
So, I'm just wondering whether what you called entropy balancing is not closely related to a technique introduced before by Rosenblum and Rubin called propensity score matching. And it's the same objective to balance covariate between treatment and the control. Did you have a look at that?
Yeah, we have run some propensity score matching models. The thing that we weren't, well, Tunde would give me a better idea than this because he actually ran the PSM models. I ran the IPWRA stuff, but we weren't particularly convinced by the balancing test that it gave us. And I think what entropy balancing does is it just provides in one nice convenient step perfect balance between your covariates, which a lot of the other methods didn't, which I think gives us this nice interpretation of the treatment being more random than if we were looking at either conventional weighting or matching methods. Yeah, we certainly have run the other types of models, but at the moment we're most convinced by the entropy balancing stuff.
And did you try also the causal DAG graphics suggested by Julia Pearl? You know, the directed acyclic graphs to the DAG technique by Julia Pearl.
I didn't quite catch the start. Sorry.
Okay.
But if you email me with the
okay,
that would be great.
Great, thanks, Jean-Louis.
Because this technique of balancing is highly criticized also because it's somewhat artificial.
Yeah, that was. Yeah, it does seem that it is a bit artificial in how we, you just force these things to be balanced.
Yeah.
So yeah, it does. Yeah, I do appreciate that concern. Yeah, yeah, we would have to do some more reading around this particular method to be sure about the intricacies of it, I think.
Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, Jean-Louis. Next is Alex Bryson had his hand up next.
Hi. Yeah, I don't think you should be shy about the method, Alex. It's quite well trialed. It's just one of a number of ways of using reweighting estimators to construct a counterfactual, given that you can't actually observe the counterfactual in the real world, namely what would have happened in the absence of being fired or quitting. So, I mean, when you come back to Stefan's point, it's simply we look for spells, as I understood it, Alex. We look for spells in which either it ends in a quit, a fire, or nothing happening, and that these things are balanced on the covariates that we use to construct the entropy score. So I think it's not wholly unreasonable. When it comes to the actual results and their interpretation, I think we need to be a bit more cautious. If you think of your last couple of slides, on the one hand, you said, I think at one point, oh, it looks like clubs don't really gain, and that this would be odd in a principal agent framework when it's in the gift of an employer, admittedly at some cost, to dismiss a worker for underperformance, especially if we think, and this is the point you were making, some coaches could be quite good for you. However, there's two crucial issues here. One is job match quality. And so what's the quality of the match between the employer and the worker? And we say and can say nothing about that. Why? Because we're looking at average effects.
Yeah.
We're talking about average effects of what happens relative to a counterfactual where you do nothing, where the principal decides to get rid of you. On the average, nothing there whatsoever about heterogeneity across coaches, never mind heterogeneity in the quality of the job match. But you have, quite rightly, I think, referred to it somewhat by talking about what we call, you and me anyway, clean and dirty post periods, yeah? Holding on to the same coach or not. Because that's an after the fact sort of idea that actually some matches are better than others, and if you don't get rid of them, then they prove themselves. Of course it's endogenous, of course it is, but it gives you a little bit of insight there. But the second thing, and it comes back to the work that Stefan and Thomas Peters have done, of course, is and the hot hand idea. Yes, you might think your current manager is rubbish. Yes, you're the principal and you can fire your agent in the hope that you're going to find a manager who's going to be better in the next period. But what, if I remember what Stefan and Thomas used to tell us about this, and this is another paper, the ability of a team to hire such a coach is partly a function of the productivity of that team. There's a hierarchy of teams who are more or less capable of drawing from the distribution of manager talent, depending upon where they are at the top. So Liverpool have a strong prospect of grabbing Klopp from Dortmund. Why? Because they're already a good team and they don't have to prospect in that unknown world of talent.
Yeah.
So this is about team-specific hiring power in the sort of market for talent that Thomas and Stefan referred to. And I think if we could go to work on that, we might find something more. So I would strongly caution against the simple conclusion that principals cannot improve their performance by sacking managers. Rather, on the average, given the nature of the estimator we've been deploying, we can't find very much. That's a very different answer, a very different conclusion.
Yeah. No, that's reasonable, I think. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Alex. Juan de Dios has his hand up.
Hello, good afternoon. Well, first of all, I love Alex's presentation. It's a very interesting presentation, and I'm happy when a PhD student do such a great job. So. Great for you, Alex. You are receiving many criticism, and this is very positive. So I know when you are a PhD student, it's not something that. But the fact that you are getting so many questions is something very positive, because it means that there is some scope for improvement. My question is also a doubt I have about this approach. When I see your comparison between managers who quit and managers who leave, who voluntarily leave, I see that the forecast of dismissal and on voluntary leave both depend on previous performance. So I guess there is an issue, an identification issue there, because this manager that apparently voluntarily leave, we see that he is probably one of the candidates to be sacked probably in some future weeks, and this is my comment.
Yeah, no, yeah, certainly what we would expect is that how we term quits, at least anyway, is that your performance in that club is probably better, because it's by definition, you're being poached. But yeah, dismissals are teams who probably aren't performing so well, and that's the reason why they dismiss anyway. Yeah, it's an interesting one. So they would likely be a candidate for future fires. I guess, yeah, but so in the industry we're in, everybody is a candidate for a fire anyway, regardless of where you've been before, regardless of what your previous successes have just been. It's just, I guess it's just one of the features of the job market that it is. Yeah, it's very interesting comment though.
And well, coming from this comment, what about a dismissal? Can you identify with your model? You can a dismissal that is completely unexpected, and check whether what is the impact on performance of this type of dismissal. I think this would be another interesting question, I think.
Yeah, we could certainly do that. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks, Andy Diaz. Stefan has a follow-up comment. I don't know if, Stefan, you want to make your argument yourself rather than have me read it out and have a discussion about it.
All right, I could do that. Why not? Yeah, I just think I'm not sure the treatment control logic works here. It's not, the game can't be the unit of analysis. It's got to be. I think from everything you said, it's the club which is the unit of analysis, because you're measuring the performance of the club and you're tracking how the club's changes over time.
Yeah.
And then the problem is then all the clubs are treated, and in fact all the clubs are treated multiple times. So I don't know how the logic of the treatment control group works, setup works in that context. There is literally no control here.
There is.
Well, yeah.
Explain it.
It's spells of games, yeah. So spells of games occur, and there are 10 spells without a change, 10 spells ending a quit, 10 spells ending in a dismissal. We can even do them with the length of our data within team. In fact, we had team fixed effects in various analyses at various junctures. So what we're doing artificially, as somebody said, is basically aligning those types of spells that end in nothing, that are 10 games long, spells that end in a fire, spells that end in a quit, knowing that they're different, they're totally non-random. So the trick here is just simply rebalancing such that on variables that we think are important for both treatment and outcome, treatment being fire, quit or nothing, and outcome being points into the future for a football team, we're rebalancing them on things like surprise and points and so on.
So your results are about 10 game spells, and you're telling us about what makes for a good 10 game spell rather than a bad 10 game spell.
Yeah, well, the future analysis period goes up to 25 games in the future. So we're looking at those 25 games that followed an event, comparing them to these counterfactual spells that we've identified that didn't experience this event, which is that treatment versus control.
Okay, I mean, I'll just leave it as saying you've got to admit that it does sound a little odd. It does. If that's what you're saying it is, then fair enough. But I don't think. I think we understand this in terms of clubs, and all your discussion was in terms of club performance, not really in terms of 25 game spells and what it means for a 25 game spell. But I want to make a different point actually, which is, so let me just leave that. But I want to make a different point, which is more about the general way you're presenting this. I mean, I've argued for many years that mostly managers don't matter very much. They don't make much of a difference. And your data seems to be just is another good example of how managers just don't matter very much. They don't make much of a difference. And rather than you when you present this, you frame this entirely in terms of, you know, the maintained hypothesis is that managers really do matter. And maybe you just ought to give more weight to the alternative, which is there's lots of reasons to think that managers might not matter that much. So managers, so for example, they're not, these are figureheads, right? We know these are symbolic individuals. We know that many times you appoint a figurehead who has no particular ability or skills, whatever. And that argument has been made not just in the context of all sorts of organizations, but in particular, I mean, even in business, we often talk about, for instance, examples in Japanese management where, you know, the purpose of being the CEO of a Japanese company is to provide an incentive for other employees to work hard, not to actually do anything. And in fact, you know, that's an argument that's been made. And so I just think, you know, rather than talk as if we really have to show that managers matter, but actually maybe we could just say, well, we don't know, maybe they do, maybe they don't. Our evidence says they don't.
Yeah, that's reasonable, I think. Yeah, I guess in many ways it's just being bogged down with the rest of the. Maybe it's just an expectation that we form as fans, rightly or wrongly, that we want our manager to make a difference, and you know, that's, I guess, how the rest of the papers have started their framing of the question. So, but no, I mean, there's no harm in framing it the other way and saying, okay, they might not make a difference. But with that being said, you know, the discussion that we started with about Rosen from 1990, his argument was that managers should make a difference.
Yeah, Rosen also believed that free markets are perfect and will solve all of our problems, and that the state is an evil organization. I mean, Rosen is no god. I mean, you know, we should not bow at the altar of Sherwin Rosen, who I even met once. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that, you know, he has, you know, his research is important, but it by no means, there's plenty of work in labor markets that point to massive inefficiencies which are systematic and consistent. And you know, if you want to go all Chicago school on us, then say so, right? But I don't think you should. I don't think there's good evidence to support that wholesale Chicago school approach to the world. And so, you know, just again, balance, you know, that's one view of the world and the Chicago, but be clear that what Rosen is the archetype of the Chicago school.
Yeah, no, not at all. Not advocating any particular style of economics, but no, I agree with your point. Yeah, you know, we could entirely frame it in a different way. The results would say the same thing. It's just how we would yeah. No, yeah.
I mean, again, it's not, you know, it's not a matter of saying, you know, this way is the right way or this way is the wrong way. Is that they're just to recognize that there are alternatives, and it doesn't have to be one. You know, the market works perfectly. View of the world. It's weird. I think most sports economists are actually not huge Chicago economists. I think most sports economists, most of the people in this room at the moment, actually do not believe this. And yet, in the sports economics literature, you see Rosen and the Chicago School referred to over and over again. That's completely weird. I mean, you don't have to do this, guys. Markets might not work perfectly. That's possible. You know?
Thanks, Stefan. As the supporter of a team that's changed manager many times in recent years, in fact, they have not had a manager for more than a year for over 6 years. My theory is, and it's totally only tested on my own team, is that most managers are rubbish, and there's a few good ones. You have a good manager, and he takes you places. We've had 2 good managers in 30, 40 years, and they've taken us places. So, so
a rare skill.
Yeah, that's my take anyway. We chop and change, and it's the same every time. But Sarah has asked you, can your spells that you've been using for your analysis, can they go across seasons?
They do, yeah. So if we were looking at a game that was 10 games towards the end of the season, then yeah, performance in T+25 would be picking that up. It's something that I'm not entirely sure about. I think I mentioned it in the talk as well, that things obviously happen between seasons, but in part that's one of the reasons why we did the between season within season analysis, because we wanted to try and rule out some of that effect. But yeah, I think there's more convincing ways that could be dealt with at the moment, because teams could also change divisions as well. It's not just that things in that division could change, and a win in the second tier is different, even though it has the same 3-point value, is different from a win in the top tier. It's something still working on that bit.
Cool, thank you, Alex. Matthew asks, just going back to the very beginning of the presentation, I thought it was quite interesting that Mourinho was the focus. Of course, in England after Man United and Chelsea Part 2, he's seen, or he was seen as someone who's run out of ideas, and this season perhaps has challenged that a little bit.
Yeah, when teams can't defend this season, you need someone who can park the bus, maybe.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments? I suspect Alex's hand is probably a hangover. Carl's just put something in. How do I know? It's a question for me, not even for Alex. How do I know those times? It was just could have been other things. You're right. Two managerial spells in 40 years. It could well be a false positive. Well, Joe Worrell was pretty good, I think. Took Everton to an FA Cup win. Not many people have managed to do that in the last 40 years. Any other questions, comments that people have? Well, the resounding silence says no, and so what I will do is I will echo what Who was it now? Someone said that it was a fantastic presentation, especially for a PhD student. It was Juan de Dios. And so I want to second that. Alex, that was a fantastic presentation, very accomplished. Delighted that it could be even your second presentation in the Roses series. So really thanks very, very much for that, and well done.
No, thanks for organising, James. It continues to be really good.
Yeah, I love it. As I say, it makes my Fridays. And speaking of that, next Friday we carry on, and I am going to do the big reveal. We have actually a slight change in the schedule. Next Friday will be Carl Singleton. So the person who's been hassling you with questions the whole time you've been presenting in these over the last 35 weeks, he's presenting. So please do come along next Friday. Referee Bias and International Relations. It's work that I'm also a part of, but I won't be answering the difficult questions either. I'll let Carl present and answer the difficult questions next week. But please do come along if you can, and please do have a great weekend. Bye-bye, everyone.